Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Life Sciences Legal Forum. This is a regular event that we run. So we run these online for a number of years now. Really just sort of do a bit of a deep dive on specific legal issues affecting life sciences businesses. Delighted that we're going to run a session around crisis management today. We listened to feedback. This was a subject that people have suggested on previous events, and so we're delighted to run this. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Ed and Will from Lexington, a strategic PR firm focusing on the life sciences and healthcare sectors, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves when I pose the first question. I'm also delighted to be joined by a number of my colleagues, Doug, Christian, and Peter, who will all sort of introduce themselves when they join the discussion. But you're all very welcome here. Just in terms of some admin. There's going to be plenty of time both during the sessions and the discussion and at the end to ask questions, and please use the question and answer function on Zoom to do that. If you could please just sort of identify yourself when you pose the question, just so that if we don't have time to deal with it during the session itself, that we're able to sort of follow up and answer your specific question. But what I won't be doing is to identify any individuals or organisations as we go through the session today. This session will be recorded, and we will make the link available to people after the session. And finally, we will provide you with a feedback form at the end, and please do spend a bit of time just completing that. As I say, we listen to people's comments in terms of the sorts of issues you want us to cover, and we can factor those thoughts into future events. So, without further ado, crisis management, and I think we've run a number of these events with our partner organisations to date, and we think it really works well because you get access to the broader skills and knowledge of a number of organisations. And I said I'm delighted to be joined by colleagues from Lexington here today. So the plan is we will have a discussion around broad PR principles. We'll look at some of the specific obligations attaching to directors and companies in the context of preparing for crises, dealing with crises, and then we'll look at some specific case studies as well. And as I said, there's plenty of time for questions as we go and at the end. So Ed and Will, just to get the ball rolling, probably a couple of questions here just to think about. Sort of, first of all, what are the different stages of a crisis in PR terms? Keen to get your thoughts and insight there, but also I'm keen to sort of think through those big pitfalls for businesses when dealing with a crisis. So from your vast experience, when have things gone really well and when have things gone really badly? So Ed, Will.
Yeah, sure. Look, thanks very much, James, and great to be here today. I just very quickly, by way of introduction, my name is Ed McRandall. I'm the director and head of the healthcare team at Lexington. As James mentioned, Lexington is a strategic communications company. We work with healthcare companies of all sizes, of all stages in their development, to work with them both on their proactive comms and proactive NHS engagement or engagement with government, but actually also what we're talking about today around when things go wrong. And I'll let Will introduce himself just in a second. But I think what we want to talk about and to speak to James's questions is, I firstly just want to touch on what the impact of a crisis can be, because I think that's really key to how you look at the stages and look at the pitfalls, because ultimately when you're in a crisis communications, far more than just impact your reputation. It can have quite a significant financial impact in terms of the confidence shareholders might have with you. It can have a real impact on your engagement with your key stakeholders, be that healthcare professionals who don't see you as somebody they want to engage with, partner with. It can have an impact on clinical trial recruitment. It can generally just affect your ability to be as successful as you can be as a company. So it's really critical that you do have a plan for this, you focus on this, and you kind of take it something really seriously. And I think the thing I would say to talk about the stages of a crisis is very much that, no one wants to be in a crisis, which is fairly obvious to say, but no one often expects to be in a crisis. And that often is actually a mistake, because very much the first stage of a crisis is always about before it ever happens. And if in a lot of ways, it's the most important thing you can do when it comes to crisis communications is to plan and prepare. Because when you are in that crisis situation, it's almost impossible to keep ahead of the story, keep ahead of developments, keep ahead of how things snowball. Because in the age of social media, in the age of kind of quicker online media, it's very hard to contain something if you're trying to figure out what you're doing on the fly, so to speak. So it's really critical that you have those plans in place. And I think broadly, that first stage of a crisis is that pre-prep. And what's critical is that as a company, you look at where you have risks, where you are at potential of crisis, and we'll look at some of those scenarios later. And there's broadly 5 things you need to consider as part of that. And I think it's firstly, and this sounds quite obvious, is in the event of a crisis, who's running the show? Who has responsibility? Because I think where we've seen things go wrong is when we get drawn into work with a client who's in a crisis and is still determining who has responsibility for internal management. If you're doing it at that stage, you risk things getting much worse than they could be. I think similarly, you need to think about what are your areas of risk, not just in terms of the areas where you could have a crisis, but if you have a crisis in, say, data management or clinical trials, what are the areas of risk that exist for you within that? Because if you've done that beforehand, you can respond much better, much quicker, and then minimize the damage. I think thirdly, what's really critical is that you look to digital. You look to how can I use our website, our digital channels, the modes of communication that we own to get our statement and to get our perspective on these things out there as quickly as possible. You need to know what your channels are, you need to know how you're going to use it, and you need to have those protocols in place. But I think just kind of, lastly on this is that you need to make sure that you're not having lots of different functions who are operating in a different way. You can't have legal divorce from comms, divorce from potentially HR, depending on the nature of the crisis, divorce from marketing. You need these people to be in concert, and you need to know who's going to be dealing with the media, how they're going to be dealing with the media, and the personnel involved. And I think I would just say lastly on this is that you also need to, as part of that prep stage, is run a simulation on it. Think, if we're in that crisis, how will us and the team react? Because that first stage of the crisis is always what you do beforehand. And it's the most important because it ultimately determines how damaging a crisis can be to you, to your bottom line, to your internal morale, to your engagement with patients in the NHS. And ultimately, that's really critical. But I'll hand over to Will to kind of focus on the different aspects of it.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks, James, for having us here today. So, having talked through the importance of preparation, now let's think about how best to handle the crisis once it's started, once you're in it. And of course, that's very difficult to do, not least because things are moving very quickly. But there are a few very critical principles here to remember in the back of your mind. The first is authenticity. Your actions in a crisis should really express your business's core values. The second, transparency. Even when the news is bad, transparency earns trust with your stakeholders. The next is speed. It's an obvious one, but to fill that information vacuum and control the message is really important, particularly in the first few hours of a big crisis happening. The next is agility. Being able to respond and adapt to meet the changing environment. You can't always stick to the same message in a crisis, and those that have been in the midst of it will realize that sometimes when new information comes out, you have to adapt to the external environment. The last one, and it's a really critical one, is consistency. So, what is your message? Who are you speaking to? And there is sometimes a naivety when we're thinking about the stakeholders that we communicate with in a crisis, that we see them as individual stakeholders. But of course, if you're communicating to a customer, if you're communicating to, for example, the regulator, you have to view them all as public, as the information that's going out there is publicly accessible. So if you don't have a consistent message that goes out to all of those different groups, you can quickly trip up. So to your question, James, a really common pitfall that we see in crisis comms management. And with these 5 principles in mind, there are sort of 4 steps really that when you're in the midst of a crisis that you should be thinking about following. And if you follow these basics, you'll more or less be on the right track. The first, you need to activate. So to Ed's point, if you've done the preparation beforehand, you know who the right people are, you need to boot up that crisis team. And it's pertinent to why we're here today, that we see that coordination between people with different skill sets in that crisis comms team. If it's just being dealt with by comms people, we're going to lose the expertise of legal and medical and vice versa. So, knowing who that is instantly so you can get it up and running. The second is establishing the facts. We'll come on to this when we touch on some of the case studies, but do we actually know what's happening? Who's impacted? When did we find out? And then the third point is asking the tough questions. Sometimes we don't want to sort of lean into that worst case scenario, but it's really important. One of the first things that we always do is put our journalist hat on and think, if we were coming at this from the other side, what are the juicy questions that we would be asking? So it's much easier to start with the Q in a Q&A than thinking that you always need to have the answers. Come at it from the perspective of how bad is this going to get? What are the risks? Who's impacted? Ultimately, where the NHS and patients are concerned, what does that look like? Because that's the news angle. And finally, and only at this point, you act. So once you've done that work, that sort of thought process, you then start thinking about what you're going to do, what you're going to say, and who you're communicating with. How are you going to communicate that effectively? So again, to Ed's point, if you've done that preparation, you know which channels you're going to use, and that consistency of message. But that also includes thinking about some of the stakeholders that sit on the periphery that in the midst of a crisis you can sometimes forget about to your detriment. So making sure you've got all of those bases covered is really important. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of when you're in the midst of a crisis. And as I say, we can come on to the case studies that I know James and colleagues were going to touch on shortly. But I think the other point, just in the same way that preparation is sometimes overlooked, the third and final stage of a crisis is actually after the worst of it is over. And for many people, that's when they down tools, they think we've got through this, move on to the next issue to deal with. And that, of course, is another big pitfall, because a crisis doesn't end just when it's out of the headlines. So it's really important to do that, to learn lessons and rectify mistakes. So we'd always advise people to find that time after the crisis has started to die down, to reconvene the key players that were involved. Sometimes that means involving third parties, and it's really valuable to do this, particularly in the life sciences when you're dealing with such critical third-party stakeholders like the NHS, like MHRA, or the Department of Health and Social Care. Sometimes actually fronting that up and speaking to them about what happened and what lessons you've learned is a really credible way to finish on. But running through the timeline, thinking, is there anything we could have improved, anything that delayed us getting our message out there, any issues in communicating to your stakeholders, and then potentially adjusting the crisis protocol if necessary when it's still fresh in everyone's mind. And finally, and an important one, if things haven't gone so well, do you need to look at training? Do you need to organize some more rehearsals, some more simulations? And of course, you can't forget the importance of reassuring your stakeholders that you have indeed learned the lessons from the crisis. So hopefully some useful pointers there, but very happy to go into more detail later on.
Really, really, really useful, Will and Ed. Thank you for that, and I think that sort of provides us with a great structure going forward. I like the point about actually thinking through what those really juicy questions are. They're going to be asked. So on the other side from the stakeholder, and actually that I think sort of moves us through to the next question I had. And if I could bring in Christian Shearsby on this. So Christian's a corporate partner, and so aside, clearly what we will be doing when we look at some of the case studies is to focus on a lot of the very sort of specific sector overlays, angles, but I'm keen to sort of always step back from that and think about the status of the entities. So most of the delegates here are companies, are execs within companies, Christian, and I'm keen to sort of understand from a corporate perspective what those legal obligations are around, first of all, preparing for a crisis and making sure that you're doing what you can to be able to react to a crisis, and then when you're in the midst of it, what your reporting obligations are around the crisis per se. So Christian, if I just bring you into the discussion now.
Perfect. Thanks ever so much, James. As James says, I'm a colleague of his in the life sciences transactional team at Mills Reeve. I primarily work with life sciences companies on transactional issues, but also on occasion have the need to advise them in terms of their responsibilities in crisis situations such as we're discussing today. And I think the points that Ed and Will have touched on from the outset is this requirement to be prepared for a crisis. And I think when we're in an environment like this, it sounds so sensible and perfect. And then when you go back to it and your day job comes back to you, you very much put other things ahead of it. And I think sort of the initial question here is, is it just good common sense to be prepared for a crisis, or is there a natural requirement for you to be prepared for a crisis? And I think in the nub of it, I think it's difficult to say, because there's no legislation out there that specifically says you have to be prepared for a data breach or a cyber crisis. So if you were to do a search to that effect, you'd come up short pretty quickly. However, I think if you take a step back and look at your general director's duties, and if you're a GC sort of advising those directors of their duties, then if you look at the Companies Act, there's some pretty wide-ranging duties in there, along the lines of the duty to promote the success of the company, duties to exercise reasonable skill and care. And I think it's pretty obvious that the damage a cyber attack can have on your company, whether that's reputational or financial. Similarly, under the duties to promote the success of a company, you have obligations to ensure that your company doesn't have an adverse impact on the community in which it works. And I think if you haven't got those preparative steps in place, then as a director of the company, you could very easily find yourself in breach of that duty to promote the success of the company. Similarly, I think it doesn't matter whether you're working in a life sciences company, a law firm. Any business nowadays has significant assets in the digital sphere, even if that's just a big bank of computers attached to the internet. That gives a gate for a potential breach. So I think the bar is ever increasing in terms of this requirement to exercise reasonable skill and care and due diligence when it comes to cyber events. So I think if you are in a situation where you've got a cyber breach, and in particular if you're a life sciences business or someone who deals with large chunks of personal data, for example, you would have been expected to have put in reasonable mitigating measures to ensure that this event was appropriately managed. So again, if you haven't done that, if you've been absent in your responsibilities to that, again, you could find yourself in in breach of your director's duties. And I think those sort of director's duties apply whether you're a private company or a public company. However, if you're a public company, that bar is obviously raised even higher, and you just have to look at the requirements of the Corporate Governance Code, which applies to listed entities in the UK, and the requirements for boards to take the steps to assess the risks that a company faces, have a board that is sufficiently able and has got the skills and the experience to be able to deal with a crisis of this type. And also, again, there's an obligation under the Corporate Governance Code that it's able to assess and mitigate the potential crisis that a company faces. And again, if you don't take those steps and you aren't aware of them, then you could find yourself in breach of that code, or otherwise having to explain on your website how you don't comply with it. So that's sort of the preparedness bit. I think looking at the second part of the question, just touching on sort of your disclosure obligations, again, I think there's a big difference here between whether you're a private company or a public company. I think traditionally, when it comes to things like this, there's very much the thought that it's best to keep things as secret as possible. People don't want to air their dirty laundry in public. And I think if you're a private company, to a certain extent, you can get away with that. You probably just need to look at your contractual obligations, whether that's under your shareholders agreement or your key commercial agreements with partners, and make sure that whatever this crisis event that has occurred, it doesn't result in you being in breach of that, the confidentiality provisions, for example, in that commercial contract, or the notification obligations under that shareholders agreement. I think if you're a public company and you're acting in the public domain, then it becomes a completely different scenario. And running alongside sort of your PR management, you also have to be very aware of what your actual sort of responsibilities are to notify the market and make timely disclosures. And I think the principal point here is, why and when would you have to make a disclosure? The UKLA guidance and other guidance on this is not as strong in this country as it is in the States. But I think you can pick out three probably key areas where you should be looking to make disclosures. I think if you're publishing a prospectus or a similar sort of admission document, looking to raise equity or funds in any way, or looking to do an IPO. If you're a private company, this is key, because whereas you wouldn't previously had to necessarily disclose, now if you're putting a public document out there, you do need to consider whether previous breaches do need to be disclosed in that prospectus. And similarly, if you're going out and raising money, do you need to put something into that document that makes the public aware of potential crises and crisis management that you've got in place? And if there is something specific, just putting a generic risk factor in that document will not be sufficient. You need to call that out and explain previous breaches and how you've dealt with them. And another place where you could look for disclosure and mitigating your risk is in your annual report and return. Public companies are required to express in their risks that the business faces and how it mitigates those risks. So again, as a public company, that's another area where you might be required to make a disclosure. And then the final one, which I think we'll probably touch on in the case studies, is what happens if you actually have a crisis event? When do you need to disclose? Is there a piece of price-sensitive information that's in your possession as a consequence of this breach, which means that you need to notify the market? So that's the final one, and I think we'll save that probably for a bit more discussion in the case studies.
I think we'll pick that up when we go through the case studies, which actually we're through to now. So I mean, you've used as an example, Christian, a sort of cyber data breach, and actually our first case study is very much in that space. Sarah, are you able to sort of call up the first case study, please? And I will ask my colleague Peter Wayman, who's a data privacy lawyer, to lead on that, and then panelists will sort of input on that. Sarah, are we able to pull up the first case study. But if I just read that out whilst it comes up onto the screen. So yeah, the company subject here, so MR Pharma, sort of a UK-based pharmaceutical company developing oncology drugs, currently undertaking clinical trials across a number of sites within the European Union for one of its lead candidates. And for this, it has appointed HAM, a UK-based CRO, to manage its trials. HAM has advised it has been the subject of a cyber attack, and data relating to the trials that are being conducted have been accessed. HAM is unaware of the extent of the breach. However, it would appear that a number of master files have been accessed which relate specifically to MR Pharma's trials. Peter.
Thanks, James. And as James says, I'm coming at this case study as a privacy lawyer. And even amongst lawyers, this sort of scenario would end up involving a number of different specialisms to work out, make sure that you were doing the right thing to respond to the incident. But I think some of the things I'm going to comment on pick up very much on the sort of structures that Ed and Will were talking through earlier. So I think the first thing to say, which is, I think, Will, you called it activate, that stage one of this would be putting into play the plan that hopefully you already have, because exactly as Will mentioned earlier, speed is going to be key here. So if we're having to make the plan at this stage, that's going to be tricky because there's a lot of decisions to make and a lot of people to involve. So, and we'd expect the things I'm going to run through are some of the things we, from a legal point of view, would expect to see in that plan. But some of those things will be who's the team that's going to deal with the incident in a cyber context, and in a cyber context that may well include, for example, representatives from IT as well as management and PR and so on. Legal, obviously. Also, what's that process going to look like? What are the steps we're going to go through? Who are we going to be involving in the decisions at each stage of that process? So I think the scenario, and I don't think people can see it, but assuming that they can't, I'll pick out bits from it because I've got it on the screen next to me. There are elements of the scenario that we've described. Bingo. Hopefully everyone can see what I can see. So although obviously we've given some headline facts on the incident, and this is not a wildly improbable scenario, unfortunately. But one of the first things that you realise is that we've only got very little information to go on. We can't really make any decisions at this stage in terms of what we do next, other than the fact that something's happened and we need to involve some people in those decisions. So I think stage one is going to be get those people together in accordance with the plan and start gathering information. So there are various parts of this scenario that need interrogating. So there are clearly going to be some internal questions for us to ask ourselves. So what's the relationship with the UK CRO contractually and otherwise? What do we know about what the CRO has been doing? Do we know about the sites? The case study refers to sites within the EU. What do we know about those sites? Where are they? Which locations are they in? What are the arrangements with those sites? Are they through the CRO, or are they direct between the sponsor, MR Pharma, and those sites? And what's the nature of those contractually and otherwise? What's the nature of this of the studies? Obviously, we know a bit, but we need to know more. What do we know about the scale of the studies in terms of volumes of data, people who could be affected, and so on? And those are all internal things we should be working through. Then there's a lot of questions we'll have for the CRO. So again, what we don't know here is, so at this stage, HAM is unaware of the breach, other than master files have been accessed. But what we don't know from that is what exactly, is it the whole of those master files? One when we say accessed, does that mean accessed in unencrypted form, or were they still encrypted? Can people read what they've accessed? And so really we'll have a lot of questions around the nature of the data, volume of data, sensitivity of the data. Clearly there's the potential for this to be special category health data relating to the study participants. But we don't know that yet. What's happened? What was the nature of the breach? All we know is that it was a cyber attack. Where's it gone? Who made the attack? Do we know whether any data has been taken other than accessed? And do we know whether or not something's happened? In other words, have the study participants, patients, been contacted or contacted us? Has anything happened as a result of it? So I think there are a few questions there for us to be looking at, and I think that information gathering exercise, we need to do as much as we can as quickly as we can to make some decisions, but clearly we're at the top of the clock is ticking on some of the things we need to do here. So it may be that there's a stage one with stages to follow on the information gathering. From a legal point of view, from a privacy point of view, a key question here is going to be establishing both the role of MR Pharma and CRO and the sites from a data protection point of view. So MR Pharma is likely as sponsor to be the controller. We can be pretty sure about that. We don't know for certain whether the CRO is a controller or processor based on these facts. Fairly likely in the UK would be a processor. Could be, in theory, a controller, joint controller in respect to the trial, and I think we need to do some more digging to be sure about that. And one of the reasons that's really important is it's the job of the controller to do notifications to the ICO if that were necessary. We're obviously going to need to be looking at the contract based on the information about the sites. We're going to be looking at the jurisdictions this has been impacting. So where's this data been lost? Which was it in the UK, or was it held by the CRO in another country? Is that in the EU, or is it outside the EU? And where are these study participants? Are they across the EU? Which countries? How quickly can we track that down? So that again may well affect our notification obligations. So we need to get the team together, do some information gathering, and then we're going to be looking at some of those notifications, and we're going to be saying, do we need to tell the Information Commissioner about this or any other regulators? And that's going to be informed by any other, so I should say, data protection regulators in that instance, and others as well. And we're going to be considering where was the breach, and post-Brexit, in theory, that could involve a notification in the UK and in the EU. But we don't yet know whether we need to notify, because we don't know the extent of the breach and the extent of the data, but that's being accessed. But that's something that we're going to be needing to look at, and that would need to be within 72 hours. So we need to work pretty quickly on that. If we took the decision we need to tell the ICO, then it is possible that you can make an initial submission to effectively confess to the incident, but provide further information by way of follow-up. Obviously, you need to be careful there. You want to be confident. You need to make that notification first, and then make that judgment. Also, from a data protection point of view, you're going to be considering, do we need to tell the individuals? And again, it's not quite as straightforward as determining simply if there's been a breach, we need to tell them. Again, it will depend on what's the nature of the data that's been accessed, what might be the impact on those individuals. So, for example, in theory, if it's only an extract of those master files, and it's only, for example, name and email address that's been accessed, and everything else has been successfully encrypted, so couldn't be accessed, it may be that telling them about the breach may cause disproportionate distress, and it wouldn't be appropriate to tell them. So again, we can't hang around, but we need to make an assessment on that. And as well as those sorts of considerations that are on my watch, there'd also be considerations of under GCP around MHRA notifications, and also HITS committee notifications, so that it's likely, again, depending on the facts, but assuming some patient data that has been accessed, that those sorts of notifications will be needed. And exactly as Christian's outlined, there may be consideration around what notifications or publications are appropriate as a result of whether you're a listed company or not, what might be required there. And the other point, and Doug, from a disputes lawyer's point of view, may touch on this as well later on, but there'd also be the question of, well, do we need to be telling our insurers, and if so, what do we need to tell the insurers, and what might that mean for the team that's dealing with this? So, for example, which law firm might we be working with under our arrangement with those lawyers to deal with this? Do we get any choice in the matter, and how might that work? So I think we're aware that there are some frameworks for assessing the kind of risk around cyber breach that you may be considering in a clinical trials context, and that might be used by the team that's doing these kind of assessments. And obviously, this is an area that's developing quite quickly as the nature of these breaches changes, and so this is definitely something where you'd expect your own flowchart and process to develop to reflect the best practice on these things as they move. I was going to say briefly, obviously I guess it's been touched on already, that there's a need to look back at the end of the process as well and say, what did we do and what could we improve and how do we avoid it happening again? And I was going to, I suppose, emphasize that the main message from me on this scenario would be pretty similar to the things that Will and Ed have said, which is around the importance of planning, integrating the response from the different specialists to make sure that the right decisions are made, and getting that right balance between responding quickly and getting those inputs. One question I was going to ask Will and Ed actually was on the kind of list of comms that I mentioned, the kind of whether it's notifications to regulators or to the patients if necessary, or vice versa. How many of those would you want a hand in influencing from a PR point of view to get right? All of them, some of them, or what would be normal?
Yeah, I can jump in on that, and it's a question actually, Peter, that many of our clients ask as well, because when you're communicating with some of those stakeholder groups, they might not traditionally feel like an audience for a PR agency, which obviously predominantly you'd think that we'd be dealing with media, the public at large. But it goes back to my point around the consistency of message, and I think it's always safer to involve a communications professional, either in-house or external, in all of that, because you ensure that consistency of message. And where we have seen things go wrong is where someone has been responsible for communicating with a customer in the NHS, thinking, well, I'm in charge of customer relations, and they've included more information on a crisis there than they really should have, because they've not seen that as a public facing document. That letter's gone out, and then in those instances it's been picked up by the GP trade press, which then got picked up by the Guardian. So you can see how that process can escalate quite rapidly. When a simple thing like the consistency of a message is lost. So to answer your question, I think if in doubt, just run it by the comms team. Certainly, if it's going to patients and if it's going to regulators as well, it's just helpful, from our perspective, just to make sure we've got a sense of what's going out the door.
Great, fantastic. Thank you for that, Peter. If delegates have got specific questions, then please do feed those through the Q&A, and we can either sort of deal with them as we go or at the end. And I had some specific questions for Will and Ed, particularly in terms of dealing with the media, but perhaps we can sort of pick those up towards the end. But clearly we're seeing some sort of consistent themes as we go through these case studies. So without further ado, Sarah, are you able to take us to case study 2, please? I mean, obviously we've focused on a pharmaceutical case study, and I mean, if you're a medical device diagnostics business, you can obviously sort of see some sort of analogous types of issues. So this is around clinical trial failure. So MR Pharma has progressed one of its lead candidates to a phase 3 clinical trial. They just become aware that the readout for this pivotal trial shows that the drug candidate has missed a number of primary endpoints. And actually, I'd like to bring in Will and Ed perhaps first, just to give some thoughts, because clearly this is you see these. I mean, with significant failures around clinical trials, and even for phase 3, you do see these scenarios from time to time, and I'm keen to sort of get their thoughts and insight in terms of sort of how you manage this kind of issue, and then I'll focus on some of the legal and risk areas.
Yeah, sure. I can kick off on this one. Look, I think the first thing to say when you have this scenario, which does sadly happen fairly frequently, is that you have to realise that it's a highly emotive issue, and it's a highly emotive issue for you, your staff, who put lots of energy into things, for you and your shareholders, who would clearly affect your price, but actually it's an emotive issue to all the people who work in and around the disease area that you operate in. And you have all of these people who will be emotive about it, will have concerns, or their hopes may be dashed, etc. So you have to think about how you manage this so that you put yourself on a firmer footing. Because obviously for a lot of companies, one clinical trial will be one point clinical trials, other products. And it's important that we put things in place that build trust, that allow you to move on from this, and that you don't undermine your reputation as a company by what is clearly a very negative result. First thing I would say around this, around kind of, reporting the facts, and obviously, you'll have the obligation and the duty, as I'm sure James will talk about, to release clinical trial data. But I think the first thing I would say on this is that where companies can often go wrong is that they almost go in the bunker a bit on this. There's almost a sense of, particularly if I'm honest, driven by commercial, which is, this is bad, therefore we'll put out a statement and we'll move on because it's done, my energy is expended on it, leave it, if you see what I mean. That's a massive mistake, because I think that doesn't take into account all the variety of different stakeholders, from patients to patient groups to campaigning groups to HCPs, who will be invested in this, that you may need, as I'll talk about in a minute, as part of your kind of future strategy. So it's important not to go into the bunker and to have that common strategy that takes all this into account. I think the second thing, and this is a kind of, I suppose in a way, relatively straightforward point, which is, be very transparent with the data and be very open about what the data means. Don't be tempted to put an overly optimistic spin on this. I think you will, in the long run, gain more credibility of your stakeholders is if you acknowledge the fact the results are disappointing, and then talk about what you do next is the key point. So don't try and put a positive spin on it. I think we saw that throughout the pandemic with people such as, happened to AZ actually a few times, when they, particularly the FDA, tried to talk about things in a way that was overly optimistic, and then that drew the kind of ire of both the FDA, the scientific community. It erodes trust amongst the people who will be your customers later on. So it's really key that you actually have that clarity, and you show them that you are a trusted partner that responds in a scientific way. But I think what's really going to be key in around this is how you coordinate and communicate to your wider stakeholders, again, the HCPs, the patient groups, even your internal staff, and having that consistency of message. And I think ultimately, and this is what you need to think of in a lot of crisis comms, you need to think, what is my end message on this? What is my point of resolution that moves us on from this crisis? And ultimately, that's always going to be driven by the scenario that you are in as a company. And I'll quickly run through a couple of those. So let's say, for instance, MR Pharma's stance after this negative clinical trial data is that they're going to look to replay aspects of the trial to focus on different indications. Then there's quite a clear way in which you can kind of move on and demonstrate that you are still a company that's really serious, and then, move the story disappointing news. However, we're still committed to looking at it in area. It might be a paediatric indication, it might be a later indication. It depends obviously on the factors. So that's one of your points of resolution. I think secondly, it might be that this is the only clinical trial you have for this drug, but you might have a pipeline of treatments in oncology coming down the line. So again, it's really critical that you keep your stakeholders engaged on side and you communicate clearly with them. And then you take that as your point of resolution by talking about the next steps will be around continuing to focus and invest in that pipeline area or that therapy area, let's say oncology for the point of argument. I think lastly, and this is where things are more difficult, is I think if this is very much a do or die clinical trial for a company, and that might be because it's the only candidate they have in oncology and a wing of their business might close, or in a slightly more kind of apocalyptic scenario, this is the drug that their whole business is kind of pinning their hopes to. I think what is clear about this is you still need to have an exit strategy. You can't look like you just failed the commercial side, therefore, shut up shop, move on. It's important that you don't manage your way out of that crisis, because HCPs will remember the business, they will remember you as individuals. And I think what's really quite key here is you talk about, and you have your comms as a way of saying, we will continue to work with patients, the patient community and HCPs to move on from this. Now that's gloriously vague, but what it allows you to do is to have that dialogue with these stakeholders that isn't done through this crisis communications. You're allowed to talk frankly and openly with them in a manner that isn't through the media where everyone's emotive, everyone's emotional, because as I say, this is a difficult issue and there is often no dressing it up when it's very disappointing. You just have to engage your stakeholders, identify your way of resolving and moving on from it, and then look to take the emotion out of it and talk to them in a much more calm way that enhances your reputation for future clinical trials.
Thank you, Ed. That's great. Well, let me just pick up on some of the immediate issues from a regulatory perspective. So as Ed has mentioned, you've got the obligation for full disclosure around trial results, and clearly that sort of ties into the comment that Will made around transparency. So that's that overriding principle. But I think you need to understand status of the trial. I mean, this very much sort of indicates that the trial is at an end, but if it's still ongoing, then depending on the failure, there may be a requirement under the regs to halt the trial. So that clearly needs to be thought through. But thinking through the failure, is it a patient safety issue or some other issue around efficacy? If it's efficacy, then there is that change of the benefit risk balance. So patient safety may be an issue. So clearly there are those statutory obligations around notifying around adverse drug reactions, adverse events. You may need to notify regulator. You're going to have to notify research ethics committee anyway. And then it's what is that plan, which Ed has covered really succinctly in terms of what that messaging is. I suppose one of the things we commonly see is actually around the pipeline and the impact on the pipeline in terms of those candidates coming behind. Are you talking about a corresponding and embedded technology where you're potentially going to have the same sort of issues? So it's assessing that broader point, and that goes back to the issue in terms of almost being ready for the next time, and how you're sort of mitigating a lot of those issues. I mean, if I just bring in Christian sort of very briefly, just to talk about some of the, I mean, this is clearly an issue where you may also have corporate responsibilities, Christian, in terms of notification, and then we can move on to the final case study. So Christian.
Hi, James. Thank you. I think that's absolutely right. I think if you're a public company and you find yourself in this scenario, you very quickly need to speak with your nominated advisor or sponsor and your legal advisors and your PR team, because I think in this situation, what you need to consider is whether you need to put out a regulatory news announcement and make the market aware. And I think the things that sort of go into that consideration are, this a piece of inside information which effectively breaks down as, is it information that directly or indirectly concerns the company? I think, yes, it is. Is this information not generally available at the moment? Well, you're the only people in possession of it at this very point in time. So the wider market isn't aware. Is this information sufficiently precise? And I think this is where you need to start looking at the facts, as James was saying. Is this the end of the line, or is this just an initial finding? You need to get specificity on that as soon as possible. The key point here is, if this information was made public, would it have a significant effect on your price? I think looking at the facts here very quickly, it's one of your lead candidates. It had got all the way to phase 3. I think you've probably been notifying the market during the course of its development over the last few years. People will be waiting for an announcement in respect of this trial. And I think to delay disclosure in this circumstance would most likely be wrong. And I think what you need to do here is notify the market without delay. And that's where you need to get together with your advisory team and make sure that announcement is both accurate but also portrays the company in its true light.
Take myself off mute. Thank you, Christian. That's great. So perhaps if we move on to the final case study, I'm going to ask my colleague Doug MacDonald, who's a litigation partner within Mills Reeve, just to talk us through this. But this is a scenario, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of these issues in and around COVID as well, with global scarcity of raw materials. So if I bring Doug into the conversation and just talk around this final case study, Doug.
Great, thank you, James, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Doug MacDonald, and I'm a commercial disputes partner here at Mills Reeve and part of our life sciences team. So the case study, which I will hopefully you'll have appear on your screen shortly, but the case study is MR Pharma has an established manufacturing and supply chain across the UK and the EU. ISO is a key supplier of resins used in the manufacture of MR Pharma's lead drug candidate, MRP1. ISO has just communicated to MR Pharma that due to a global scarcity of raw materials, which we're seeing a lot at the moment, it will be unable to supply its proprietary resins to MR Pharma, and is in fact serving notice on MR Pharma to terminate the exclusive supply agreement. This will cause significant disruption to MR Pharma's supply chain, and supplies are needed for the manufacture of MRP1 for both clinical trials and commercial supply. So the non-supply of the resin and the purported termination create a lot of issues to consider. The main considerations will relate to legal, regulatory, commercial, reputational, and practical issues. And the key point here really is that you have to look at all these points together at the outset to ensure that you do not compromise one of those areas at a later point. The timeline, like any crisis, will almost certainly be urgent. So it is important to establish quickly MR Pharma's position in relation to all of those key areas. Between James and I, we are going to highlight a few of the key issues involved. I'll come on to the more legal points shortly, but the starting point is always going to be to look at the agreements and the contracts between MR Pharma and ISO, but also MR Pharma's agreements with other connected parties. In theory, the starting point of what you can and can't do should always be contained within those contracts and documents. Establishing the legal and the regulatory obligations will then allow MR Pharma to consider the immediate commercial and technical impact that ISO's termination has on its position, but without compromising the legal and or regulatory position at a later date. So key point number one, do not ignore any of the key areas I've just mentioned. Moving on to where the termination and the lack of supply actually leaves MR Pharma, we are told that the lack of supply is due to a global scarcity of the raw material. So even if MR Pharma wanted to or was allowed to, could they substitute the resin for an alternative product? It may not be possible. So as mentioned, as well as establishing that ISO is in breach of contract, it's very important to immediately check what impact that has on MR Pharma contractual requirements elsewhere in the chain and with other partners. For example, what has MR Pharma agreed to do with other partners? By way of example, there will not only be quantity and timing obligations, but there will almost certainly be contractual obligations in terms of quality and technical specifications, and almost certainly including the exact type of resin that must be used. In addition, there will also be regulatory commitments that have been made by MR Pharma, which James will pick up in a few minutes. If the specific resin is contained within the relevant contracts, it may be that MR Pharma can't deviate from that resin without itself being in breach of contract. So the immediate concern will be ensuring that we can abide by MR Pharma's contractual commitments to other partners and regulatory commitments, and making sure that MR Pharma is not left sort of exposed or holding all of the risk itself. So from a legal perspective, it's important to understand why ISO cannot or will not supply the resin. Have they run out of the product, or is it a commercial decision? Are their supplies running low and they've decided to prioritize another partner at the expense of MR Pharma? We also need to check, do they have a contractual right to terminate? And note, you cannot take back a termination once it's been served. But if they do have a right to terminate, does that actually mean they can stop supplying, or are there any runoff provisions? Another point to check would be whether ISO is entitled to rely upon any force majeure arguments. And again, this is a creature of contract, so you need to check the contracts. The legal considerations are going to be also against the backdrop of where ISO are located if they are in a different jurisdiction. And just a final point to make here, and has been made throughout the session, being prepared is the best way to deal with a crisis. So if you do have a key supplier, or you have contracts where you have committed to third parties to use a particular product like this resin, then check that those contracts are fit for purpose, and don't wait for something to go wrong when you actually look at those contracts to find out perhaps they're not fit for purpose. I'm just going to pass back over to James briefly now to comment upon the regulatory and IP considerations.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of really short points. I mean, the first is that the resin may actually be called out in your regulatory filings. Quite often a resin is an integral part of the manufacture of the formulation. So there may be a requirement. You may not just be able to swap it in and out. There may be a need to alter your regulatory filings, which obviously require interaction with regulators and other partners. I suppose the final issue, it talks here about proprietary resins is around IP. It may not just be as simple as bringing in another resin. You may need to understand sort of ability to use freedom or freedom to operate from an infringement risk perspective. So there may be those broader issues, but that's about really that plan going forward. I think hopefully what's coming clear with all of these case studies is that need for a coordination of a broad range of issues, and almost sort of scoping those out really very early on, and hopefully actually a bit before, and that's part of the prep. And maybe in the last few minutes, if I could just go around the panelists and maybe talk about sort of a key take-home point in relation to all these issues, because I'm conscious we have covered an awful lot this afternoon. So perhaps if I turn to Ed first of all.
Myself off me. Yeah, look, the key thing for me is when you're in a crisis situation, maybe be surprised the crisis has happened, but don't be shocked that you've ended up at some point in a crisis. Be prepared, have those systems in place, have that prep in place, make sure you understand it so you can move quickly. Because ultimately, in any crisis, you need to make sure that with the news agenda, you are saying things first, you're making sure that you're right in the information you're provided, and ultimately you're coming across in a human, engaging way that keeps you in the right situation for your stakeholders.
Great. Will, actually, could I ask a specific question, which is actually how you deal with them, a top tip for dealing with the media? So I think we've talked about The Guardian, etc. Maybe just a thought in that space, please.
Yeah, I think a couple of points here. So the potential traps when handling media inquiries that we often see. Being pushed to go further on something you're not confident talking about is quite a common one, and it's that control of message. A good journalist will try and find very sneaky ways to get additional information out of you, but just stick to your guns. You have an agreed statement, you have potentially some notes to editors that is information that you're happy to put in the public domain but won't be attributed. And I think differentiating between the two of those, sticking to them rigidly and making sure you don't open yourself up for more inquiries, ensuring that any inaccurate statements don't go unchallenged. So, you see this sometimes. A trade publication might pick this up and report something. It's really important to get in there very quickly and ask for a correction or a clarification, because if that's not the case, suddenly it gets reported elsewhere, and then it's very difficult to maintain control over. And then getting dragged into an even bigger story. So, we've touched on it there with the supply chain issue. We've mentioned Brexit, in the context of that as well. What you don't want in the case of case study 3, for example, is to suddenly find yourself in the middle of a impact of Brexit storm, which can happen quite easily at the moment. So those are just a couple of the things, but always get it in writing. A lot of journalists like to handle things over the phone, but it's much safer that you've got a paper trail and that you can just very clearly articulate what is on the record, and indeed anything that might not be on the record.
Great. I'm conscious of time, so perhaps if I come to one of the M&R teams, if I come to Peter, just in terms of sort of a final recommendation from a sort of a legal and risk perspective, please.
I was going to go back to what we were saying earlier about acknowledging the importance of teamwork, and I was going to reflect on something that Will had said in terms of characterising what was important in comms earlier about authenticity and transparency, and I guess acknowledging that there's always a tension there between the different stakeholders and their inputs on the messaging, and clearly those things are really important and will manage risk, including legal risk, because if you get that messaging right, you're less likely to get a claim. But equally, the lawyers will be talking to you about accuracy and about not saying the wrong things too soon, and so it's trying to get that balance right, and that's all about that team that we keep talking about, and the team that's in the plan, getting the right people together to make those decisions.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I don't think there are any further questions, so without further ado, if I close this session, but before I do that, if I can just give a vote of thanks to all of the panelists. That's been a wide-ranging and fascinating discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.